Hello, my name is Holly M. Crawford, and I am the Director of Adult Public Programs at LACMA. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm honored to present this lecture series, Rethinking Conquest, which is presented in conjunction with two exhibitions now on view at LACMA. Mixpantli, Space-Time and the Indigenous Origins of Mexico, and Mixpantli, Contemporary Echoes. I have an installation view in my backdrop and highly recommend seeing these works in person. The exhibitions are co-curated by Dr. Deanna Magaloni, the Deputy Director, Program Director, and the Dr. Virginia Fields Curator of the Art of the Ancient Americas, as well as the Suzanne D. Booth and David G. Booth Conservation Center Director at LACMA, and Alice de Carteret, the Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in the Art of the Ancient Americas Department at LACMA. I'd like to invite Alice de Carteret to the virtual stage to provide an overview of the exhibition and introduce this evening's presenter, Jeanette Favrot Peterson.
Thank you so much, Holly. Both Mixpantli exhibitions were conceived to rethink the traditional narrative of conquest, creating an opportunity on the 500th anniversary of the fall of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan to center instead the creative resistance of indigenous artists. Their works, illustrated histories, featherworks, stone sculptures, and cartographic paintings, tell a story not of defeat, but of perseverance, renewal, and an enduring commitment to an indigenous future. According to tradition, in 1531, the Virgin Mary appeared to Juan Diego Cuauhtlatoatzin at the hill of Tepeyac, known for its patronage of the Nahua earth deity Tonantzin, or Our Revered Mother. 3 days later, he unfurled his flower-laden tilmatli, a cactus fiber cloth, before the local bishop, revealing her miraculous image imprinted on its fibers. A copper engraving on view in Mixpantli depicts this icon, the Virgen de Guadalupe, and offers a vivid example of the dynamic entwining of Catholicism within Indigenous worldview by Indigenous peoples. Today, Jeanette Favrot Peterson will tell us more about this significant and venerated icon. This program is part of a 4-part lecture series providing an in-depth look at the Florentine Codex and Indigenous histories of the conquest. Presenters include the scholars Deanna Magaloni of LACMA, Angelica J. Afanador Pujol of ASU, Federico Navarrete of UNAM, and Jeanette Favrot Peterson of UC Santa Barbara. I would now like to introduce Jeanette Favrot Peterson, our distinguished presenter and colleague. Jeanette Favrot Peterson is a Professor Emerita in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her teaching and research have focused on the field of Precolumbian and colonial Latin American visual culture. She is the author of The Paradise Garden Murals of Malinalco, 1993, and Visualizing Guadalupe, 2014. With Dana Leibsohn, she co-edited Seeing Across Cultures, 2012, and the Florentine Codex, 2019, with Kevin Terraciano. Peterson is one of the founding directors of the Florentine Codex Initiative at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, developing an ebook on Book 12 and an enhanced digital edition of the entire Florentine Codex. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Peterson.
Hello, and welcome to my virtual audience. I am delighted to participate in LACMA's lectures on Rethinking Conquest. And today I will be focusing on the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico. The Virgin of Guadalupe is a familiar image for many of us, perhaps most of us who are in the audience today. By way of a brief prelude, however, I want to introduce the global manifestation of Guadalupe, who has appeared elsewhere in the world. These global devotions share the name Guadalupe, which comes from the Arabic for Guadalupe, or River of Wolves. The eldest or the oldest devotion to Guadalupe is from Spain, from Extremadura. You see her image in the upper right-hand corner. She was very active with the royalty of Spain, the Spanish royalty, in, so they say, defeating the Moors during the Reconquista of Spain. And her devotion traveled overseas at the time of the 16th century territorial expansion into the Americas. In particular, it took root in the Andean zone. So in the lower left, you see an absolutely beautiful Guadalupe from the town of Sucre in Bolivia. She is not the sculpture that the Spanish Guadalupe is, but she has a three-dimensional quality in that her robe is encrusted with gems. Finally, we have the Mexican Guadalupe in the upper left-hand corner, the image with which you're familiar. And she's completely different from the others in that she's a flat, that is to say, she's a painting on cloth, and she has a very different iconography. Now, what I would like to do today is to focus on Guadalupe's image and the ways in which it has been, for some people, translated into a religious icon. It is important to say at the outset that for some individuals, Guadalupe is first and foremost a religious image, a symbol of hope and healing and comfort. As an art historian, however, I'm interested in analyzing the image itself as a material artwork and as a cultural artifact. If we turn to the image and a close look of the image, we see that she is actually painted on two strips of cloth. And here she is in her basilica in Mexico City, her sanctuary, her primary sanctuary. Her image is hung over the main altarpiece and is framed in a spectacular gilded manner, as you see on the right. The two strips of cloth on which she is painted are joined at a seam in the center of the image. In places, as on the detail on the right, you can see that the combination of tempera and oil, it has flaked off over the years. And in fact, in places, she has suffered some damage, as you can see also in the solar rays behind her head. The Virgin Mary here is depicted as a young woman, prayerful with her hands clasped in front of her chest, head bent to the left. She is standing on a crescent moon, which originally was silver, but has tarnished over the years. And behind her is a solar halo or mandorla. All of these traits are very characteristic. And I cannot neglect the little angel that is holding up the hems of her robe underneath. Now, the Virgin of Guadalupe's advocation is that of the Immaculate. And that is a difficult concept for some to grapple with, and even more difficult to represent. The Immaculate Conception is a theology in which Mary's role is both human mother and virgin, completely without sin. So representing sinlessness is, of course, a challenge to artists. And what they have done over the years to represent the Immaculate Conception is to use three different sources or models. And the first is the woman of the Apocalypse from the book of Revelation, where St. John writes that a vision he's seen in heaven is of a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, what the artist has done is to take the 12 stars and scatter them over her mantle. Let me just mention again the little detail of the angel on the lower right shows us the central seam where the two lengths of cloth are sewn together. And I think you can even see a few of the stitches where the blue arrow is located. Now, a second source for depicting the Immaculate Conception is based on the Assumption of the Virgin, or representations of the Assumption. And in this, the Virgin Mary is raised body and soul to heaven after her death. You can see, I think, in the pose of the Virgin with her hands again prayerfully clasped in front of her, and she's standing on a crescent moon held up by an angel, that there are many similarities in terms of the iconography of Guadalupe. And these are two examples from the 16th century to show that it was a fairly common representation. And finally, a third type of depiction of the Virgin Mary on which Guadalupe may have been inspired is the Virgin tota pulchra, or all beautiful, from the Song of Songs, another biblical verse, which appeared fairly frequently even in Mexico, as you see in this mural from Huejotzingo in Puebla. And here, the Virgin's purity, her sinlessness, if you will, is represented metaphorically by these symbols, such as the fountain in the lower left or the Tower of David. But again, notice the pose and the crescent moon, which reappear in this depiction. So Guadalupe is, in point of fact, a kind of streamlined version of many of these visual sources that the artist was able to see and appreciate in his environment. Now, the Virgin of Guadalupe is a protean subject. That is to say, she has inspired thousands of images. So I can only cover a few perspectives in this brief talk, but my aim is to situate Guadalupe within a continuity of Indigenous traditions about the sacred that existed from pre-conquest into the colonial period. The Spanish conquest, for all its violence, did not destroy the indigenous cultures of Mesoamerica. There were, of course, many ruptures externally and a tremendous amount of violence, but what survived with great tenacity were the internally held beliefs and a certain worldview or cosmology. The Virgin of Guadalupe is a good example of this, in that she displays many traits of a Euro-Christian import, as we have seen, but she was adapted to the local conditions in New Spain. Now, the European and the indigenous factors or facets in the beliefs and practices are not easily separated. You can't easily factor out what is European and what is indigenous. It comes together as a whole new colonial product. They are tightly interwoven in the making of this American Virgin. But let us examine three aspects of this notion of continuity that facilitated the adoption and adaptation of the Virgin Mary in the devotion to Guadalupe. First, the space in which she was said to appear, and that is Tepeyac, that was already sacralized when the Spaniards arrived in central Mexico. Second, the material on which her image was impressed. The cloth itself was more significant than simply acting as a support for the paint. And finally, sacred power. Guadalupe developed into a deeply rooted devotion because of her perceived powers. These evolved slowly, but she accrued power as a wonder-working image within a matrix of ceremonial activities. Some of these activities continued pre-contact religious practices and embodied ancient concepts, of what defined the numinous or the sacred. Now, underscoring all of these is a kind of subtext, and that is what separates or differentiates an icon, which you see on the left framed in the basilica. This is the original image, from a work of art or a copy, which you see on the right. And the copy is a digitized image, which down to the last detail is very faithful to the original. So what differentiates these two images of Guadalupe? But let us turn first to sacred space. And for this, we travel to Mexico City, to the Basilica, the 18th century Basilica, which has just been renovated and opened to the public again about 10 years ago. You see it at the top of the ramp where pilgrims are beginning to enter. And above it and on the hill, on the summit of Tepeyac, is a little chapel that is also wonderful to visit. Now, Tepeyac was a very important Precolumbian site. It was at the head of one of the causeways that linked the island cities of Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco to the mainland. The name is sort of interesting. It comes from Tepeyac, which means hill and nose, literally. And it is a little bit like a nose in that the peninsula sticks out into Lake Texcoco. But it can also mean the beginning or the start of the hills or the mountains. So it is, Tepeyac itself is a small hill, but it is in the forefront of a much higher group of hills, the Sierra de Guadalupe, as they're called today. One of the best views of Tepeyac and the Sierra was made by a 19th century artist, Casimiro Castro, who liked to float over the city of Mexico and make sketches, and then go back to his studio and convert the sketches into lithographs. And this is one he made over the Basilica of Guadalupe with its very large courtyard. And you can see the hill of Tepeyac with a shining white chapel on top behind it. And then I think you can appreciate that there were other hills, other summits that were even taller behind Tepeyac. These were important in the Precolumbian world because the Aztecs did use them on their ritual circuit around the lake, and they had great ceremonial importance. On Tepeyac itself, the Franciscan friar, Bernardino de Sahagún, warned that Native American populations were still worshiping what he called idols. At Tepeyac, Sahagún claimed, they revered an earth goddess named Tonantzin, which translates as our revered or our dear mother, as you see in the lower right-hand corner. Tonantzin was an honorific title associated with several earth goddesses, those especially with powers of regeneration, with healing and childbirth, the kinds of powers we associate with the Virgin Mary today, if you're a Christian. So what is our evidence for connecting this pre-Hispanic devotion or cult to earth goddesses with Guadalupe? I want to highlight recent research done by Leonardo Lopez Luján and Javier Noguez, because they have uncovered several, two in particular, sketches or drawings of the earth goddesses as they formerly existed on the cliff sides at Tepeyac. they underscore with this new research the fact that the Tepeyac area was indeed already a sacred locale where Aztecs could venerate certain deities. Now, what we're looking at is the Códice de Teotihuacan. It's an 18th century drawing that was originally part of the collection of an Italian antiquarian whose name was Lorenzo Botturini. He sent out artists to document what was left of the remnants of Precolumbian sculpture, which the Spaniards, of course, were destroying as quickly as they could. And in particular, figures like this would be considered idolatrous, and so definitely worthy of destruction. What we see in this somewhat crude sketch on the extreme left is a little chapel on the top of a hill that has been interpreted as the chapel on Tepeyac. And then underneath, then that square walled in area, we find a sacred spring or a fountain of some kind. In the center are two figures whose faces clearly were not visible to the 18th century artist because he's filled them in with these little rubbery faces that look like the Pillsbury Doughboy, and were clearly makeshift and fanciful. The costume elements are not well understood, and he may have fabricated elements of them. But I think it's important to note that on the left, the figure is holding a shield of some kind with a feather fringe on the base. And on the right, what I want to point out is the tall headdress that the figure wears, which was called an amacali or paper house. And it is made up of streamers, braided cords, and rosettes. Now, this was worn by one of the many earth deities, Tosi among them, a grandmother earth goddess. And here she is celebrating a festival in another, a pictorial manuscript named the Codex Borbonicus. And you can see the same amacali, this tall paper headdress with the rosettes looking like pinwheels, multi-layered, and with the little flanges or streamers coming down on either side of the hair and ear spools. Now, what is remarkable is that we had only this 18th century sketch, and so for many years, it was believed that it was a complete fabrication. More recently, however, Noguez and Lopez Luján discovered a second set of drawings done about 50 years later and commissioned by Guillermo Dupe, who was commissioned also by the Spanish government to try and document antiquities. And this was a drawing also done near Guadalupe, as you can see by the gloss in the center of the drawing that's translated in the upper left. So what it says is that the reliefs were positioned a little beyond Guadalupe on a hill to the left side of the Royal Road, so on the cliffside. One figure has been completely erased, alas, so there was damage done to this dual pair on the cliffs between the time of the original drawing we looked at, the Teotihuacan, and this Dupe drawing. And it says that this statue was chiseled out. That's what we have on the left. What we have on the right, however, is still relatively intact, and it is said to represent a gigantic figure, and that might be a representation of a god, king, or person of importance. And again, we have the amacali, this tall paper headdress with the rosettes, multi-layered, and the braided cord over the forehead. So until the early 19th century, we know that there were Precolumbian relief sculptures on the cliffs near Tepeyac, where Guadalupe, the legend of Guadalupe, was said to have occurred. Now we can compare these drawings with some very mutilated traces of Precolumbian sculpture at another site near Lake Texcoco called Texcotzingo. And here again, we have two figures, female presumably because of the lower hem that indicates a skirt, and then these little feet that project out from what otherwise just look like boulders. There's very little left. Remarkably, a fragment that was found near these sculptures and that you see a drawing of in the lower right does represent an amakali, one of these paper headdresses that was obviously fell off of one of these or was chipped out, chiseled out of one of these stone figures. So we are certain that at least one of these figures was an earth goddess. And this suggests that there were shrines around Lake Texcoco in which these earth goddesses were venerated. Now, this speaks to the power of place and the inability to completely erase past histories. Now, in Europe, for example, Pope Gregory in the 6th century wanted to reclaim pagan spaces for the new religion of Christianity. He had what we call today a kind of replacement strategy, but it was only partially successful in redirecting worship from the pre-Christian divinities as these spaces continued to hold a powerful aura over the local populations. This is especially true in the Americas, where topography and natural phenomena were felt to have an extraordinary energy, an animate force that was not so readily suppressed. I would suggest that the same dynamic was in play in Tepeyac, where the presence of Tonantzin may have prevailed even in her absence. So let us now turn to the second element of continuity that I've called sacred matter. And for that, we're going to turn to the foundational narrative of Guadalupe that involves the Christian neophyte, humble Nahua individual named Juan Diego. As he was making his way to the doctrina, the Christian training he was receiving in Santiago Tlatelolco, and walking over the hill of Tepeyac to get there, he encounters a vision of the Virgin Mary. 3 times. Juan Diego was asked to convince the skeptical church officials of her request to build her a sanctuary. He was not successful, and I'll go back, sorry. And as a sign of her reality, Guadalupe then offered to have roses or flowers bloom on the barren hillside of Tepeyac. And remember, this was a winter month of December when very little was growing. Juan Diego went to pick them, placed them in his mantle or tilma. And as he did so, to the bishop, Juan de Zumárraga, the roses fell out and the image of Guadalupe appeared on his cloak. I'd like to emphasize the significance of these cloaks for Nahua men and in Precolumbian society, cloth itself. A tilmatli or a tilma, these capes, were worn by all Nahua men. It was their most essential form of clothing and a kind of ethnic marker. It signified both not only their gender, but also their status and even rank. And many of them were made of very fine materials, woven cotton. They were decorated, some were longer, some were shorter, depending again on your status in life. As importantly, cloth itself responded to Nahua concepts of the sacred. Cloth was felt to embody and contain a life force, or teot. In the Aztec world, textiles and clothing served as offerings. Cloth transformed ordinary humans into representations of gods. And cloth enclosed ancestral relics and became worshipped. So these were bundles that held the relics that were called tlakimiloli. And you can see a tlakimiloli in the temple in the upper left-hand image as the worshipers, the devotees, come with their offerings to the temple. There is a kind of a black bundle in the doorway of the temple that represents one of these sacred cloth bundles holding the sacred relics of whatever deity is being worshipped, in this case, Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec patron god. Cloth was also obviously very important in the legend of Guadalupe. The very first representation we have of Guadalupe was executed in 1606 by a European artist, Baltasar de Chadeorio. And I'm showing on the screen both a pre and a post conservation painting. So it's the same work, same painting, I should say, but it's been cleaned on the right. And I think you can see the difference in the two images. What I want to emphasize here is that Orio was particularly careful to depict the heavy folds, the sort of voluminous folds of cloth that we see falling on either side of the image of Guadalupe. In contrast to the thick cloth, the image of Guadalupe appears to float, seemingly freed from its support. She is an ethereal, a kind of luminous sign that exists apart from the laws of gravity, suggesting that she was not painted by human hands. It is possible that this reflects the fact that by 1606, Guadalupe was already said to be divinely authored. Now, Europe has a long tradition of cloth supporting sacred images, and I'll just show you one, the Saint Veronica here, holding up the face, the haloed face of Christ. The legend of Saint Veronica is that she wiped Christ's face with a handkerchief or a cloth she had as he made his laborious way to Golgotha, carrying his own cross. And you can see that, again, the cloth is quite separate from the image, which seems to stand out in front of her. On the right, Juan Diego similarly holds up an oversized Guadalupe image in which his body is hidden or occluded, but follows the exact contours of the solar mandorla. Her body is his. So we see that textiles can witness to the sacred in both Judeo-Christian and the ancient Pan-American traditions. Cloth was believed to be a carrier of the supernatural, and in some cases thought to be a transformative agent. So finally, we're going to return to the question of what converts an artwork into a sacred icon. We've already seen that the space or the context in which a religious image is venerated is crucial. Also, the very materials out of which an object is fabricated can play a role in this transformation. In addition, an image becomes potent or powerful when it is activated within a public setting and when it demonstrates its efficacy for the community at large. How is this done? Let's use a contemporary example. In 1999, digitized images of Guadalupe were beginning to be produced. Some of them were created for commercial purposes. And I'm standing in front of one of these. It's in the hallway behind the altar of the original icon in the basilica. But this is a secular space where people come and go. It's near the souvenir store where these digitized images are also sold. So the image does not have any power or charisma associated with it. It's a static object, a work of art, if you will, in a secular space. In 1999, however, 3 of these digitized images were selected to be blessed by the Pope. They were taken to the Vatican, and then they were sent on a worldwide tour. And everywhere they went, they were greeted with events that the Catholic Church planned. So there were processions, such as the one you see in Los Angeles. There were special masses. In LA, the image attracted about 50,000 people to the Colosseum. In other words, these digitized images were performing the sacred. And these included public endorsements. So organizations organizing spectacles that included song and dance, official liturgy, and pilgrimages. In many ways, we can say that these kinds of rituals characterize Aztec religious practices. They also used song and dance. They used an abundance of flowers in their rituals, which signified sacredness. They also, indigenous peoples, planned, subsidized, and participated in the earliest events honoring Guadalupe. An image then remains just a work of art unless it can prove to have supernatural powers, and that these powers are working on behalf of their devotees. Now, one work that shows this very clearly is a relatively small work. It's about the size of a notebook paper, 8 inches by 12 inches. And it's an engraving that was made soon after the Echave Orio painting that we saw earlier. For being so small, it is chock full of wonderful information and data and images. So it's worthy of study. The engraving was commissioned by an Archbishop, Juan de la Serna, of a Flemish artist, Samuel Stradanus. And it was intended to advertise the building of a new sanctuary for Guadalupe, which her devotion had grown to such an extent that by the early 17th century, she needed a new church. And in order to raise the money to build it, this was one of the ways, a kind of marketing strategy, if you will, to raise those funds for the sanctuary. Now, Guadalupe is featured in the center and as a devotional image. She appears in a cloudburst as though she was a vision, not a stationary object. She is given very Flemish proportions in this rendering and does not necessarily conform to the proportions of the tilma image. I have suggested that this portion of the engraving could be literally cut out, if you will, and hung up on the wall where you see that little circle. You could just nail it up on your wall and use it as a devotional image. Now, what's also fascinating about this engraving is that on either side, we have 8 miracle scenes. So that already by the early 17th century, Guadalupe has accrued or developed a whole series of miracle stories. And I'll show you briefly 3 of these. Number 7 is on the right hand side, and you can see it as it flanks Guadalupe in the image on the left. And it involves the story of the native sacristan, whose name was Juan Pavon, who cures his son of a terrible throat abscess by rubbing oil from an oil lamp in front of Guadalupe. The oil itself was said to have healing powers. Guadalupe again appears in a cloudburst over her altar. And the boy is cured. They give thanks. As you can see, the wife of Pavon kneeling in front of the altar. And then behind them is Mexico City. And you can see the gloss, La Gran Ciudad de Mexico. Now, I should mention that the image and the text are quite erased in places because the copper in plate from which the engraving was made had been so used so very many times to make these paper engravings. Another miracle is a very important one, and it's number 2 in the upper left-hand corner on the Stradanus engraving. And it involves a nun, Sister Catarina de Nieta. Now, what the text tells us is that Catarina was cured of dropsy by drinking water from the fountain. Notice that the nun is depicted 3 times. If we go to the distant view on the right, we see a tiny little figure in front of a circular fountain. And so she's drinking water in that scene. And then below her, she makes her way, feeling very ill, to the sanctuary. So she's fallen to the ground with her illness. Guadalupe cures her, and in thanksgiving, she kneels in front of the altar. And you can see that in the inside, the cutaway of the sanctuary with, again, Guadalupe floating over her altar. Now, what's so important about this particular miracle is that in the text, it says that at the fountain, Guadalupe appeared, apareció. She appeared to the nun, giving this whole scene, suggesting that the appearance of Guadalupe was already part of the foundational narrative of Guadalupe by the early 17th century, and long before the published accounts of 1648. I just wanted to remind you that the Codex de Teotihuacan on the left-hand side had one of these walled-in fountains below the shrine at Tepeyac. So Tepeyac had been known for probably from Precolumbian times as a source of salty medicinal waters. So this fountain was known to be curative in the mineral content of its waters. Water sources were also associated with fertility and healing, life-giving powers that were the purview of female goddesses. One final miracle scene from the engraving was so popular that it was duplicated many times, including in this oil painting. And it involves the young son of an hacendado, an owner of a big hacienda who was very wealthy. They had just been to the sanctuary of Guadalupe and they were on horseback when the young boy fell off. His foot, unfortunately, was caught in the stirrups and he was dragged for many miles and would not have survived had Guadalupe not intervened and saved his life. So this was, again, a long-standing miracle story that survived throughout the colonial period. As a final work, I would like to examine a beautiful painting that is in the collection of LACMA and that can be seen now in the exhibition Archive of the World. It's a painting that was done, we believe, by two members of the Arellano family, a father and a son, Antonio and Manuel. Now, the detail on the right below the little angel holding Guadalupe's hem is signed. You can see the signature. It says Arellano, and then there's a very fancy F for fetchit or made it, and then año 1691, in the year 1691. Now, unfortunately, the Arellanos frequently signed their works with just the name Arellano. And there were three of them actually painting in the Arellano family. So we don't know whether it was father and son, but I believe that the father executed the Virgin herself. He had a more conventional or traditional style with quite sharp frame lines to his figures and details. The son may have been responsible for the floral decoration that surrounds the solar mandorla of Guadalupe. And his style was more 18th century. He worked in the early 18th century. And you can see that in the sort of delicacy of the flowers and their colors. Let me go back and show you the four medallions in each of the corners that describe the narrative of the apparition narrative to Juan Diego. So in the upper two corners, we have Juan Diego's voyage, his journey several times over the hill of Tepeyac when he encounters a vision of Guadalupe with a wonderfully perfumed aroma emerging from her and the sound of birds singing. And she addresses him in Nahuatl and asks him to have a home built for her. When the church officials do not respond positively, he returns to Tepeyac and asks the Virgin for a sign, and she then has the flowers bloom on the hill. Now, in this little detail in the Arellano painting, she actually is handing him flowers, which he collects in his mantle. And then in the climactic final scene, we have Juan Diego unfurling his mantle. The roses fall to the ground in front of Juan de Zumárraga, the bishop, who is astonished. And in its place, the image of Guadalupe appears miraculously. So a striking feature of this work is found in these garlands of flowers on either side, filled with birds and butterflies. Flowers, especially roses and lilies, allude to Christian virtues and Mary's purity. The Arellanos include exotic species such as tulips, peonies, and berries. And this is due to a Flemish influence. In Flemish paintings, we often have these flowers that surround a sacred image. However, it's important to note that for an indigenous viewer, the flowery world and the allusion to a garden with aromatic flowers may have conjured up a sacred world, describing the Nawa belief in a desirable paradise that is described as filled with perfumed flowers, birds, bees, and butterflies. This floral decoration then may not only have been included for aesthetic purposes, but it had symbolic and metaphoric references for a bicultural audience, for both a European and an indigenous audience. An image then becomes an icon when it enters history. The Virgin of Guadalupe has become part of the political and cultural history of Mexico, and for all peoples of Mexican descent, and indeed globally for all Catholics. In this painting, royalty from both the indigenous world on the left and the Spanish Habsburg world on the right are kneeling to the image of Guadalupe, behind which Juan Diego almost disappears. He moves from being a specific protagonist in the apparition narrative to a symbol of the indigenous body politic on which a homebred Christianity in the Americas is inscribed. Thank you.